It had been a long, grueling few weeks. I'd been working on a multinational project that was close to mass production. It was a gaming unit and there had been several problems to overcome, and I'd been working at it throughout the night to get some fixes. Easter holiday was approaching and I was counting down the hours. I was working the Good Friday so I could have an extended holiday the following week. Hayley, the kids and I were heading for the farm in Wales and we were really looking forward to some downtime. And we were going that night. Then it happened. What I'd been dreading. A call from Cambridge Consultants. They couldn't get the latest software to install onto the units and they wanted me down there ASAP. And on really big projects, you have to act fast or you lose really big money. So I jumped in the car and headed to Cambridge while on the phone to Hayley apologising on the way. Anyway, we agreed she would head off to Wales and I'd get there as soon as I could. And to cut a long story short, I finished about 11:30 that night in Cambridge and headed off for Wales, having refused the helicopter drop-off. The next morning, I woke up in Wales, just a little twitched. So I sat in the farmhouse conservatory, just staring out at the fields and the mountains. And I felt a peace come over me as I watched sheep just moving from field to field. They thought I was loopy, but such a peace just watching the sheep just moving around. And I think that's where I really started to appreciate a love for creation. Its simplicity, and yet its very functional design. And I appreciated how God put it together and how easily it seemed to work. And it was in such a stark contrast to what I'd been working on, with all its intricacies and complexities. And isn't it amazing how how refreshing God's creation is, and how exhausting most of our humanity is? And in such a busy world, we often fail to take time to observe creation. Yet in Proverbs, we read about, looking at the ant and seeing how we should reflect on its ways. And this kind of stuff is not only found in Proverbs, the psalmist, writes again and again, reflecting on nature and how it causes the psalmist to worship God. I often walk up Malvern to reflect, and God has often spoken to me through creation and those walks. I find it easy to associate with the psalmist there in that way. And the psalmist says this, that God, in his wisdom, he has made them all, that he has made such a variety of things and a rich diversity of things. And in Psalm 104 verse 31, it tells us that the Lord takes pleasure in all he has made. In other words, God's creation not only brings us peace, relaxation and provision and enjoyment, but it also brings God joy. And as we have been reading in the New Testament now, it shouldn't come much of a surprise about how creation is used as an example by Jesus again and again. In fact, the Bible tells us that all things were created for Jesus and by Jesus. In him all things hold together. He's the Lord of all creation. So it shouldn't come as a surprise either that Jesus considers creation important, and that we should consider it important as well. God loves his creation, and we should too. COP26 starts today. That's the United Nations Climate Change Conference, the biggest talks about our climate since 2015. And unfortunately, as part of creation, we have messed up. And part of humanity's rejection of God has caused devastating effects on the rest of God's creation. And ironically, creation is now biting back at humanity and is starting to impact us all, rich or poor, but especially those in poverty. COP26 is the world's government's approach to fixing the problem. But unfortunately, these meetings, they just seem to end up in political posturing rather than any action. But the reality of the matter is that plastic pollution is littering our seas, and we dump our rubbish in the third world countries. The world climate is changing and is causing more floods, more storms, and more droughts. And we have many species that are going extinct at record rates. The baseline is that we've damaged this beautiful gift from God. Just look at this video to see how one family has been impacted.
For many people in the north of Ethiopia, the impact of climate change is devastating. They used to expect rain up to 4 months a year, but now it only falls in August. People don't have enough water to survive. It is an issue of life or death. And for families like Orbisa's, everyday life is a real struggle.
My name is Obisa and I have 9 children. Life is very challenging here. We have no food and are dependent on our livestock for our livelihood. Whenever there is no rainfall, our animals die as there is no grass or water. This affects our lives significantly. We will not get money or have milk to drink. We have no other option. When it rains, I only need to walk 5 minutes to collect water, but these water sources are now dry. Every night, I walk for 10 hours to collect water from a lake. The walk is dangerous. I can face wild animals such as hyenas and leopards. The water I collect is not sufficient. I am only able to collect less than half of what my family needs each day. We need most of it for drinking, but sometimes it is not enough, and my family has to go to bed thirsty. I feel extremely sad whenever I cannot provide water for my children. It hasn't rained for 6 months, and I don't know when it will rain next. It is God who knows when the rainfall will come. I worry about my children and my family. I worry about the small livestock which are remaining. I feel worried whenever I think about the future. If we could get water access in our village, this would change things for me. This is the first and most important thing that would give me hope.
There are just too many families like Orbisa's. They are being pushed further and further into poverty, and world hunger has increased year on year for the past 10 years. And all of that is down to climate change. And that is also exacerbating world conflict. You see, if you can't eat or drink, you soon become ready to fight to remain alive. I've been speaking on Micah 6:8 about having mercy and doing justice. And we've heard last week one of the most important commandments from Jesus, to love God and to love our neighbours. And over the past week, just recently, the past few days, we've also read the story of the Good Samaritan in our Bible readings. So Christian involvement in climate change and events like COP26 are vital. We honour or we love God by protecting His creation. And one way we can love our worldwide neighbours is by caring for those who are hit by climate change. And as one's living that's in a developed nation, we should be ready to lead the way in taking care of the environment rather than abusing it further, which directly affects our neighbours and eventually ourselves. And having heard all of this, it's easy to feel totally hopeless, and we're just left wondering, how on earth can this brokenness be fixed? And it might sound trite, but we do have a hope in Jesus. Colossians 1 verse 19 and 20 says this: "For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him," that's Jesus, "and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on the earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross." To reconcile to Himself all things on earth and things in heaven. Yes, our world is broken, but God is still at work, still reconciling and still restoring. In many ways, we need to get a bigger view of Jesus. He came to reconcile and restore all things in heaven and on earth. And that's a whole lot more than just me and you. He wants to restore the whole world. And that includes all of creation to make all things new. I said earlier, God, Jesus, values all of creation. He wants to sozo it. And that's a Greek word which means to save, to heal, and to deliver. So he wants to save, heal, and deliver all of his creation. His aim is to unite everything back to God. And again, as I've said before, Jesus invites us to participate in that mission to this world. So as the world cries out in pain, we're invited to join Jesus in a ministry of reconciliation and a ministry of healing. So don't think climate change is just a side issue, something that I can ignore. It's not. In fact, we should understand that it is very much part of the centrality of the gospel message. Wow, this is such a big issue. With the vastness of such a task, how on earth, where do we start? How do we respond to this? Well, let's just take a look at the story of Esther in the Old Testament. Now, isn't that story an absolute brilliant example of how to speak up against injustice? Firstly, consider how Esther responds to the news about the Persian king's plan to wipe out the Jews. You know, she didn't sit back thinking, I'm safe, I'm okay. No, she decided to take action. So, what news have we heard? Where should we be deciding to take action rather than sitting back? Secondly, she rallied her people to pray and to fast. Now, before we take any significant steps, any significant risk steps, it's always best to take it to the Lord. In fact, we should always aim to act from a foundation of prayer, and not just individual prayer, but corporate prayer. So would you be willing to raise up the concerns that have been placed on your heart? The concerns that you have heard? Would you be willing to organise prayer? Would you be willing to pray? Thirdly, she took a big risk in talking to the king. So what big risks should you be taking? Should I be taking? Where and how should we be speaking to those who have got far more authority than we have? Fourthly, she held her government and her national leaders to account. She made it clear what they were doing and why it was wrong. She even made an example of the instigator of the atrocities. So I invite you today to 1. Decide to act on the news you receive. To 2. Decide to be an active motivator and leader of prayer. 3. To be brave and to decide to speak to those in authority. Don't talk just about them to others, but talk to them. 4. To keep governments to account. To praise them when they're doing right and tell them when they're doing wrong. Recently, Hayley and I visited the farm in Wales again. It was a whole lot quicker to get there this time, as the roads were bigger. Some of the farms that we passed to get there, farms that I often remember with fondness for their quaintness and their beauty, now have had their fields tarmacked. And when I sit at the farm in Wales and start to look out, I see the power generating windmills getting closer with every visit. Oh, the irony of it all, even humanity's solution of green energy, a wind farm, still destroys the beauty of God's creation. So I'll leave you to ponder and think a bit. I'll leave you with this Joni Mitchell song and this challenge. Mark today in your diary, this day. Know you were born for such a time as this. And Joni, in her lyrics, keeps using the phrase, they. Just who is this they she is referring to? Is it the government? Is it me? Is it you? Is it us all?